Welcome to a very, very unique show with a very, very unique person. I'm going to rattle off some name of companies. Just first absorb the companies. IBM, Xerox, Apple, HP, and in between maybe a Sony and a BMW also thrown in. One man has worked for all of these and actually was instrumental in changing the way that these companies went out to their customers. I'm very happy to introduce to you Satjiv Chahil. Satjiv, thank you so much for joining us. A very, very different career from what most people could actually have. And I have to say, it's going to be an interesting journey today to find out, because you've actually worked with some, if I was to say top 5 at one time, you worked with all of them at some, and I even forgot one of the big names also in between was an incredible company called Palm, which is supposed to change the world, but I think they didn't read their palm very well, and the astrology didn't work out for them, and they tanked with what I thought was one of the best products ever. But let's start the journey off. My first question, of course, is we'll trace the journey. But the first one that I really want to know, which is what everybody's always been interested in, is your time at Apple. As the person who may well have changed the way things were, did you work with Steve Jobs at Apple? Did you meet up with him? Is he exactly how he's been shown in the books and the movies? Was he a very different human being? What was your interaction there?
Yes, I never worked for Steve, but I knew him for almost 3 decades. First, as he toured Xerox, is where he first saw, says, the inspiration behind the Macintosh.
Yeah, you use the word inspiration. A lot of other people use a very different word for what Steve did with Xerox technology, but be that as it may. So how was it? You were at Xerox, Steve used to come across.
And I was part of this group in Palo Alto that actually created the vision of the world we live in today, and pioneered all the technologies that make this digital age possible. Unfortunately, this center was in Palo Alto, which people thought of as the left coast those days. And all these scientists were highly educated hippies who weren't there just for technology, for controlling people and managing information, but for changing the world. And that's what then, as you mentioned, Steve actually hired the entire R&D team from Xerox. Larry Tesler was the CTO at one time. And then as Apple launched the Macintosh, it was basically a vision that had been established at Xerox. And so I ended up part of that migration path. But after Steve had left, and with John Scully, who had then figured out that if American corporations and this industry did not move the battlefield overseas, Japan Inc. would take it over, as they took over every other white good industry, etc.
Right, wow. So a lot of people speak about this, and I really want to know, and this is purely, of course, only from your heart, it's conjecture, right? So a lot of people say if Xerox was not only about techies and scientists and people who didn't know how to market and how to have the right PR, couldn't build hype and buzz, then most probably we would be using, instead of an iPhone from Apple, we'd be using a Xerox iPhone, a Xerox book, a Xerox iPad, right? Do you believe that that's the kind of technologies that were in play? They're the ones who started it all, and the rest of it was just curated beautifully and marketed by Apple.
It's very true. The Xerox, actually company success leads them to their failure. So Xerox was selling so many copiers, making so much money. Somebody there had the foresight to set up this research center in Palo Alto. And that just gave a blank check to these scientists. But then they didn't put the commercialization process in place. So each person would leave. Somebody created a telecom company called 3Com, somebody else created Adobe, Apple created the Mac, the Apple Mac with Adobe software created desktop publishing. So their origins were there, and the employees from there went on to change the world, which always drove them.
So the cradle really was Xerox part, right? And everything came out from there almost. We actually did a small story where we tried to trace some of the world-changing products and where they all started, and most would originate in Xerox Park. And that was amazing because other than copiers, they have no other legacy right now. Nobody knows about what all they invented, but here we are, and you're actually saying that's exactly how it was, right?
And I'll just share another story I've never shared. Also, what was created or driven from there was the multilingual standard called Unicode. So the fact that we have Hindi, Punjabi, Indian languages, Chinese, Japanese, Cyrillic languages. There's an office neighbor of mine, Dr. Joseph Becker, who we just call Joe, who actually broke the code to write.
Wow. So another thing that, of course, everybody wants to know about is your interaction with Steve Jobs. Today, we have so much of media around him, books that have been written. He's become a legend in everybody's eyes. But whenever we read about him, we see the movies. The latest movie that's come out depicts him in a slightly different manner from how most people would look at him, right? So how much is accurate when you go? This is a man you spent time with. This is a man you interacted with. This is a person who knows John Scully so well, who's a very good friend of yours, right? When you see these movies, what do you feel? Are they getting it right?
You know, he was a complex man. He was a brilliant man. And nobody can take away from the success of Apple. Right. It's made huge contribution to the world, and changed what technology does for us. But nobody is perfect, and neither was he at that level. Right. But it's hard for me to judge the books and the movies because one sees inaccuracies that other people believe as absolute truths on both extremes of things. Right. And so I'm a bad person to comment on any of the books or the
So when you saw the latest movie, did you come out happy? Did you come out a little disgruntled? What's the emotion when you see something that is depicting a legend in his own time on screen and you knew the legend?
Yeah. No, so there were many things that people who were part of what they showed in those movies feel that, Steve Wozniak felt, things were accurate from his point of view. Right. If you talk to John, some weren't, some weren't. So different people have different perspectives. But in the particular movie episodes, those were not my interactions from him. But I learned a lot from him. And even though I didn't work directly for him, many of the staff that worked for him, I would, learn things from, and from his gurus. What is not brought up in these books and movies is that he was able to seek out talent and knowledge. Right. And he learned design from a gentleman called Hartmut Esslinger, who was a German. And he's the guy who was actually design advisor to Sony's Mr. Morita.
Okay.
And Steve always had an obsession and admiration for Sony. In fact, even the times I was at Apple, everything in the Macintosh was sourced from Sony. The Triniton screen, the hard disks. Right. They even manufactured the first PowerBook. He also discovered two people. One seems kind of obvious, Johnny Ive, the designer, but I think Tim Cook was one of the most brilliant moves that Steve Jobs ever made. Okay. Because whenever at Apple we ran into trouble, it was either the product didn't show up in time, something was missing, something didn't work, the inventory went out of control. So it was these behind the scenes necessity of a business that makes businesses successful in the long term, just not the innovation that they introduce. So Tim Cook, in my way, was his final great stroke of genius.
Let's get down to, I think, another very important thing. So you were with IBM. Today, the IBM you were with and the IBM that we have now is a very different beast, completely different company. Xerox, that we already spoke about, could be the cradle of almost all modern technology, but they never were able to use it.
Yes.
Palm could have changed the world, did not end up doing it, right? You worked with HP, which again is very different from where it was when you were heading the marketing out there and what it is now. Is this pretty much the way it now works, that companies that were traditionally large multinational giants, you were telling me off camera that when you did go to the US to study, you joined IBM,
Yes.
and you spoke to your grandmother and said something. Maybe you could tell us about that to the rest of the audience.
Yes, no, when I had graduated, I was, brought up the traditional Indian way, wanting a job with a steady company. That's what your family wanted.
Right.
And those days, the banks and all were considered big, but IBM was the new computer company everybody was totally amazed by, and I somehow landed a job with IBM. So I wrote to my grandma saying, your prayers were answered. I'm working for the world's greatest company, and this company is, more and more powerful every day. And at that time, you couldn't visualize a company with greater impact. It could stand up to governments,
Correct.
as it had to stand up for the Indian government at the time. And yet, when any entity gets so powerful, some people within there go and see other opportunities and create new companies. And IBM actually missed the wave of the copier. The people who invented the copier, photocopying machine, apparently pitched it to IBM, and IBM didn't go for it. And they created Xerox. That funded this whole Palo Alto Research Center. But I'd also like to mention, you mentioned HP, where I worked. HP deserves credit for being the originator of Silicon Valley.
Really?
Because the founder, the first garage in Silicon Valley was the HP founders'
Mr. Hewlett
garage.
and Mr. Packard together, when they were tossing the coin to say, should it be Packard, Hewlett, Packard?
Exactly right. And so they were graduates from Stanford.
Okay.
And they could have worked for the banks or the railroads, and they, with the support of their wives, decided to create a company in their garage in Palo Alto. Today it's considered a historic site of Silicon Valley. And bringing it back to Steve Jobs, his first summer job was at HP.
Oh.
And Steve Wozniak's creation of the Apple, the first Apple computer, he was an employee of HP. So that whole spirit of, entrepreneurship, doing things differently, giving people a chance to go out on their own, was these two companies. And so I had the good fortune to be part of these, and now it's just the next wave of things. Even Palm was actually sort of an offshoot of Apple. So in Scully's time, they'd done the Newton,
Right.
which was the first
that
concept.
story I'm familiar with. So the Newton actually did inspire the Palm and a lot of...
And the difficulty was the handwriting recognition. So the Palm came out of the handwriting recognition with something called graffiti. And the first product was Palm Pilot. It's hard to believe, but in the year 2000, when I was with Palm, Palm was cooler than Apple.
Yes.
I got invited to better parties. And it was the thing, and it broke the gender barrier. There were more women using the Palm because they multitask. And the first smartphone was also from Palm.
Correct.
And Steve loved the Palm and the Palm smartphone. It's when Palm started getting influenced by analysts to make it more Microsoft-like that it took the wrong turn. And that's where I believe Steve saw the opportunity. And so he took what actually the vision of Palm, and he executed it better.
Well, like they said, you can either have hype and buzz or you can have hype and hope. I think a lot of companies got left behind because they created the hype and then they lived in hope. Only some people can actually take it forward. From all the companies, and you worked with literally the most iconic companies in the entire world. From all of these, I'm not asking you to choose a favorite, but I'm asking you to choose the most exciting time that you had. It could be because of the time you joined. It could be because you were setting a new path for them. It could be because they were on their way down. You were able to rescue them. From all that you worked with, which company did you have the most exciting time in, and why?
Absolutely Apple.
Okay, all right.
So I'll tell you the learnings. In IBM was like our old military boarding schools in India. Very disciplined, very good training, learned manners, etiquettes. I always reply my emails and phone calls. So learned a lot of good discipline there. Xerox was very forward-looking. It taught us about quality, and so there's things learned there. But the most fun and invigorating time was at Apple. I was set off with a team of people to make a beachhead in Japan, and we ended up going from an unknown company. In fact, when people used to see boxes with Apple logo, they'd put them in refrigerated trucks. And we ended up becoming the most preferred brand.
So you were the coolest company there in refrigerated
within
trucks.
Within 3 years, we built $1 billion dollar company. But what was interesting is that we did things in a very unique manner, and I had the complete freedom to do things. So we had American developers working with Japanese localization companies, creating Japanese typography that's so superior to anything the Japanese had ever done, and learned from them the quality in the packaging, the precision, and doing marketing in so many unique ways. So I had that absolute freedom, and that's where I got to have a close relationship with John, because John used to be then, if you would call him, the governor of Silicon Valley. He was the most sought-after person, and he could land in any location and we'd command the whole media. And so he was my whole brand budget, was John Scully. So it worked really well, and that's where we conceived the whole notion of multimedia and digital media.